I should have died that day. Sometimes, when the silence of dawn weighs on my bones and my body still aches in places where there are no longer wounds, that phrase returns like an insistent whisper, I should have died. I don't know if it's guilt, anger, or just the echo of time that refuses to pass. But the truth is, I came back. I came back carrying more than a poorly healed scar on my abdomen or the chronic ringing in my left ear. I came back carrying men who didn't return, words I never said, and promises I didn't have time to keep. When I look at my hands, still steady but marked, I wonder why they're still here when so many others were left buried forever in the desert on the other side of the world. And no one has ever answered that question. Living, after everything, wasn't a prize. It was a sentence. I settled in a forgotten corner of the city, far enough from the bustle, close enough to silence. I don't answer the phone. I don't respond to letters. It's been years since anyone knocked on my door, unless by mistake. I like it that way. No one to ask if I'm okay. No one to remind me of what I lost. My routine became a sacred ritual. Waking up too early, walking until the pain flared, coffee too black, and then the void, a void I learned to tend to as if it were a loyal companion. Sometimes I feel like the world moved on and left me here, stuck in an invisible trench, with my eyes open and my heart closed. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, my hand gripping the mattress as if I were still holding the rifle. Other times I don't sleep at all. I stare at the ceiling until daylight breaks, and in those moments one question always returns. Why me? Why was I the one spared? Because it wasn't luck. I know the difference between luck and a miracle. Luck is missing by inches. What happened to me was something that pulled me from the hands of death when there was no logical reason for it. But back then, I didn't see it that way. I just wanted to forget. I just wanted to erase the image of the eyes of the kid who fell beside me seconds before I was dragged away. And for many years, I succeeded. Or at least, I thought I had. It was only much later, many silent winters and dragging mornings, that I began to notice that the world hadn't given up on me the way I had given up on it. But at that point in the story, all I was a man too alive to die and too dead to live, and that was the cruelest punishment of all. The first time I allowed myself to break the routine was by chance, or maybe it wasn't. Sometimes I think chance is just the name we give to things we don't yet understand. The truth is, that day started like every other. Bitter coffee, joints aching more than usual, the porch chair creaking under my weight. But there was something different in the air, a drier cold, a shyer light, and somehow I felt I should go out. Not far, just to the corner. I had avoided that direction for months. There was a small square where mothers usually played with their kids, and all I could see, there was the reflection of what I'd lost. But that day, I went. What I found wasn't anything extraordinary, just an old wooden bench and an elderly man sitting in silence, staring at fallen leaves. He wore a worn-out coat and military boots. I recognized the cut of the uniform before I even noticed his face. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something in them that stopped me. Cold, he carried the same weight. It was like I'd found a mirror. We didn't say anything, we just sat. And in that strange quiet, something broke inside me. The silence between two men who survived the same storm has a strength that can't be explained. And in that moment, I realized I might not be as alone as I thought. From that day on, I started going back to the square. Sometimes he was there, sometimes not. But the mere possibility of meeting someone who understood my pain without asking about it made leaving the house less of a struggle. I still carried everything with me, the screams, the faces, the shrapnel. But now there was a place where I could exist without pretending. It was during one of those encounters that he told me a story so absurd I would have laughed. if it hadn't hit me in a way that hurt. He said he was saved by a light. He couldn't explain it. He said he was certain he was going to die. He had accepted it, but seconds before blacking out, he saw a white light, intense, serene, and then silence. When he woke up, he was on the ground, alone, but whole. They told him it was a collapse, a brief seizure. He believed it was something else. He called it a miracle. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to scoff. The other part wanted to believe, because as much as I denied it, as much as I pretended not to remember, I had seen something too. That day, in the field, before I was pulled out of there. I saw, but I wasn't ready to accept it yet. For weeks, I carried his story inside me like dynamite ready to explode. I kept going to the square, sometimes finding him, sometimes not. And even on the days he didn't show up, I sat on the same bench, let time pass, and forced myself to remember that I was still part of the world of the living. For the first time in years, my steps weren't just dragged by the obligation to keep existing, but pushed by a seed of restlessness. Something was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the light that creeps into a room when we leave. A crack in the window opened. I didn't know it yet, but that crack, that small space hope had opened in me, would be all the miracle needed. It was on a night of strong wind that the dreams came back with vivid clarity. I hadn't seen those images in a long time. The dusty field, the muffled sound of gunfire, the screams around me. But there was one part I never told anyone, not even myself. The exact moment I fell, and everything stopped. It wasn't dark. It wasn't pain. It was white, as if the world had been erased and rewritten in silence. And in that suspended moment between before and after, I felt peace, not fear, not despair. Peace. It was as if someone was there, with me. I never spoke about it. I brushed it off. I forced myself to believe it was delirium, that it was the effect of trauma, blood loss, fear. But that night, lying in my bed, with wet eyes and my chest beating harder than usual, I admitted in a low voice, for the first time, I saw the light too. That acknowledgement didn't heal me. It didn't lift me from bed with the vigor of a reborn man, but it broke me, and sometimes you need to break to rebuild. The next day I went to the square earlier. The bench was empty. I waited. 1, 2 hours. Nothing. I went back the next day. Still nothing. Days later, I learned he had been transferred to a nursing home on the other side of the city. He didn't leave an address. He didn't leave contact information. But he left a story planted in me. A story that was now also mine. And for the first time, I felt responsible for it. That night, I sat on the porch and wrote everything I remembered, word by word, pain by pain, light by light. I wrote without stopping, as if I were pulling something out of my body that had needed to come out for years. When I finished, I felt a different kind of silence around me, not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of presence, as if, somehow, I had been heard. That marked the end of what I can call the first part of my new life, the part where I was still fighting against the truth of what happened to me, where I pretended surviving was enough. I didn't know it, but from there, something greater was beginning. And even without fully understanding what it was, I was, for the first time, willing to find out. I was raised not to talk about feelings. I grew up hearing that a real man endures pain in silence, that crying is weakness, that time heals everything. But time didn't heal anything. It just stacked days, like old boxes in a dark attic. After I wrote that letter to no one, or maybe to myself, something inside me shifted. It wasn't pretty. It was uncomfortable, like a bone snapping back into place after being out of joint for too long. For the first time, I felt the need to seek someone out, not for rescue, but for listening. That's how, one ordinary late afternoon, I crossed the door of the city's Veterans Center, a place I had avoided like someone running from a mirror. The kid at the reception was too young to understand, but kind enough not to ask questions. He led me to a small room where a group of older men was talking. I sat without saying a word. No one forced me. No one tried to make small talk. I just kept going back. For weeks, I listened to others' stories, different in details, identical in emptiness. One of them spoke in a low but steady voice. He said the thing that hurt most wasn't what he saw, but what he stopped feeling after he returned. That hit me like a blade. That was it. I had stopped feeling too, and when a man loses the ability to feel, he's no longer living. He's just existing. It was during one of those meetings that I met Ruth. She wasn't part of the group. She was the daughter of a veteran who had passed away months earlier. She started attending the meetings because she said it was the only place where her father smiled. One day, she brought me coffee. I thanked her with a nod. The next day, she brought two, and she stayed. The kind of presence that doesn't intrude, just remains. She had attentive eyes, but not probing. With her, silence didn't weigh heavy, and that, for someone like me, was rare. Little by little, I started talking. Nothing big at first, comments about the weather, traffic, the taste of the coffee. But every small conversation is a disguise for what we really want to say. One rainy afternoon, I told her about the light. It was the first time I said it out loud to anyone. Ruth didn't smile, didn't doubt. She just held my hand and said, "I believe you." And in that moment, something in me eased. The faith of others can be a pillar when ours is cracked. I began to understand that the miracle I experienced might not have been just the moment I was spared, but the silent path that brought me there. To a woman who listened with her heart. To a group that saw me without judgment. To a place where the past no longer had to be a burden. I started writing more often. Not just memories, but sensations. Things I never thought I'd have the courage to put down. I started walking farther, cooking with more care, even arranging the house differently. They were small gestures, but they were mine. Each one brought me closer to the life I never thought I'd have again. And as strange as it sounds, what surprised me most was the sound of my own laughter. Yes, I laughed. Sometimes unintentionally, other times with tears in my eyes. And that's when I realized the miracle wasn't surviving, it was feeling again. Some pains don't scream. They just sit there, like a pebble in your shoe. Small enough to keep walking, but persistent enough to remind you, with every step, that something's out of place. As much as I was changing, there was still a space inside me I avoided touching. It was like a locked room in my soul, where guilt lived alongside the names of those who didn't come back. Until one day, Ruth asked me something simple. "Have you ever visited your unit's memorial?" I swallowed hard. The answer was no. And it wasn't just a lack of time. It was fear. Fear of what I'd find. Fear of looking at the reflection of those names and realizing I still believed I didn't deserve to be alive. I spent the night awake thinking about it. I found myself rereading an old notebook where I'd written names, dates, words spoken in the heat of war. I remembered the muffled laughter in the trenches, the letters written in haste, the looks that said more than 1,000 speeches. I woke up with heavy eyes but a firm decision. I called Ruth and asked her to come with me. It wasn't just a visit, it was a confrontation. The drive there was silent. She respected my silences like someone who understands that some battles continue even after the war is over. When we arrived, my legs trembled. It wasn't the cold. It was the invisible weight I'd carried on my shoulders for over 2 decades. Each name carved on those walls was a wound still open. And among them was the name of a kid who called me brother, though we weren't blood. He had covered me that afternoon. He shouted my name seconds before the explosion, and then came the light. The memory hit me like a blow to the chest. I fell to my knees. I didn't cry with desperation. I cried like someone finally opening the floodgates of a lifetime. Ruth knelt beside me and said nothing, and it was there, among names and memories, that I understood the true miracle. It wasn't just that. I was saved. It was that I was called back by voices I thought I'd lost. And in the midst of that clean pain, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Forgiveness. Not from God, not from others, but from myself. On the way back, I sat on the porch and wrote a letter. I didn't know who it was for. Maybe him, maybe me, maybe time. I wrote with the steadiness of someone who no longer wants to run from their own story. I ended it by saying, "I promise I'll honor your life by living mine." And I did. It was after that visit to the memorial that something inside me finally aligned. I can't say I became a different man overnight. No miracle erases decades of pain in a blink. But there was, in every gesture, a new kind of resolve. When the sun touched the porch and I sat with my coffee, it wasn't to wait for the day to pass. It was to be present in it. I started noticing the sound of birds, the smell of the old wooden fence, the breeze coming from the field. They were things that had always been there. I was the one who hadn't been. Ruth remained a constant. With her, life was light but meaningful. We didn't talk about the war every day. In fact, almost never. We talked about life, recipes, books, good memories buried under the dust of survival. One day she brought me a box. Inside were letters. Her father had written in his youth. He was scared too, she said, but he said the love waiting at home was stronger than any bomb. That broke me. I realized that many of the men I knew didn't just die in the field. They died inside, long before crossing any border. And that gave me even more strength to keep living for real. I started participating more actively in the Veterans Center meetings. Over time, others began to listen to me. Not as a hero, nor as someone with answers, but as a man who knew what it was to sink and still come back up. In one meeting, a young guy fresh from service said, "You talk differently, sir. It's like you saw something." I just smiled. Yes, I saw. I saw death up close. I saw life hiding inside me. I saw the light, and most importantly, I saw the way back. I don't know exactly when I decided to write my story. Maybe it was one of those days when your chest tightens and the pen eases it. But I wrote, with all the flaws, fears, and truths I'd avoided for so long. And when I finished, I didn't feel pride, I felt peace. As if every word written had returned a piece of me that got lost somewhere in the past. At the end of that year, Ruth took me to the top of a hill where her father used to go when he wanted to think. The view was simple. Trees, a dirt road, the distant sound of a stream. She looked at me and said, "He thought this was the closest place to heaven." I believed her. And in that moment, looking at the horizon, I felt I was finally ready to move forward. Not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time, it wasn't bigger than my will to live. I started the new year with something I hadn't felt in a long time. The desire to wake up. It might seem small to those who've always lived in the flow of things, but for someone like me, it was everything. Getting up with purpose, with a sense of presence, was uncharted territory. My steps no longer dragged so much pain. My chest no longer carried only silences. Ruth was still by my side, as she always had been. Not as someone who came to save me, but as someone who walked beside someone who chose to stand. I started organizing the house, renovating small rooms, opening windows that had been closed. For years, each wall that got a fresh coat of paint seemed to dust off my own soul. I went back to visiting places in the city I used to avoid. The library where I went with my father, the newsstand where I bought papers, when I still believed the world made sense. I went to the post office and sent letters, real ones, with paper, envelopes and stamps. I wrote to old comrades, distant relatives, a childhood friend I thought I'd never see again. Some replies came, others didn't, but the simple act of reconnecting was like planting seeds in soil I thought was barren. Even my body started responding differently. The pain still came, of course. There are things time doesn't erase. But now I knew how to deal with them, not as enemies, but as parts of my story. At the Veterans Center, I started helping with the listening circles. I heard men who were where I'd been, men who thought they had nothing left to give, and every time I told my story, I felt it stop being a burden and become a bridge. Many came to talk to me after the meetings with wet eyes and a lump in their throat. "If you made it, maybe I can too." Those words were like an echo, not of my voice, but of the life that had been pulling me back since that day in the field. I began to understand that the miracle that saved me wasn't just mine. It needed to be shared, spread, sown in the pain of others. Ruth encouraged me to send my manuscript to a small local publisher. I hesitated. I was afraid. But she reminded me that stories kept in a drawer die with us. A month later, I got a call. They wanted to publish. They asked for few changes. They said my text wasn't about war. It was about healing, and I liked that. It was exactly what I needed to hear. When I held the first printed copy in my hands, I trembled, not from weakness, but from reverence. Because every page was a piece of flesh and soul I had left there. The life I led no longer resembled the one before, not because everything became easy, but because I had finally chosen to be in it. Choosing to live, with all that it entails, pain, laughter, losses, new beginnings, is perhaps the greatest miracle of all. The invitation came by letter, handwritten, with steady calligraphy, like the old days. It was from the local high school. A history teacher had read my book and asked, with great respect, if I'd be willing to talk to a group of students about my experience. "They need to hear from someone who lived it," he wrote. My first instinct was to decline. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because facing young people with clear eyes and unbroken dreams stirred a different kind of fear. The fear of not being enough. The fear of being fragile in front of a generation that only heard of war as a dusty chapter in books. But Ruth, as always, looked at me calmly and said, "They don't need a hero. They need truth." And that's how I accepted. On the appointed morning, I put on my navy blue jacket, the same one I wore to my grandson's graduation, and pinned a small brooch to my chest, the only military symbol that still brought me some comfort. I entered the room with a tight heart but open eyes. The faces staring at me were curious, attentive, respectful. They didn't carry judgment. They carried questions no one had answered. And there, I saw myself as more than a survivor. I saw myself as someone who could give meaning. I spoke about the war, yes, but without embellishment. I talked about fear. I talked about the silence after the noise. I talked about the light. And more than that, I talked about the afterward. What happens when the medals lose their shine and the uniform becomes a memory stored in basement boxes? I spoke of loneliness, guilt, reconstruction, and I saw in some of their eyes an emotion I didn't expect. When I finished, there was a moment of silence that didn't make me uncomfortable. It was a good silence, full. A boy raised his hand and said, "Sir, thank you for not giving up." I smiled and answered with a choked voice, "I almost gave up, but someone or something had pulled me back." In the days that followed, I received dozens of notes, emails, messages. Some talked about veteran grandparents who never shared their stories. Others just said thank you. And that's when I understood, without a shadow of doubt, that my miracle wasn't just surviving. It was finding purpose where there was only emptiness. It was turning pain into a bridge. My past, denied for so long, was now a tool of hope for others. With Ruth, we talked more about the future, simple but beautiful plans. A short train trip through the countryside, a garden with herbs and tomatoes, the idea of adopting an old dog from a shelter. Things that once seemed trivial now felt sacred. There was no more rush, no more running. There was presence, and in every day lived with attention, I felt a new part of me bloom where before there was only dry soil. The last winter arrived, gently, not with the cruelty of previous years, but with a mature silence, as if the season understood it no longer needed to challenge me. I welcomed it with a blanket over my shoulders, a steaming teapot nearby, and Ruth sitting in the chair beside me, reading aloud passages from the book we published. It still felt strange to say my book, as if something so intimate could really exist in the outside world. But it did, and now it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the hands that held it, the eyes that read it, the souls that saw themselves in every line. One afternoon, I decided to visit a place I hadn't been to in years, the Veterans Cemetery. I brought simple flowers wrapped in brown paper. I walked among the names, many known only by how others remembered them. I found the grave of my friend, the one who shouted my name before the chaos swallowed me. I knelt. The wind blew hard, but it wasn't cold. It was alive. I stayed there for a time I can't measure. I said things I'd never said. I asked for forgiveness, yes. But more than that, I thanked him for giving me another chance, for letting me live the life he couldn't, for giving me time to find meaning. I left a small medal beside the flowers. It wasn't one of the important ones, but it was the one that symbolized my return, my crossing. It was my way of saying, "You still walk with me." As I stood, my body ached as it always did, but I didn't mind. Each pain was now a reminder that I was there, that I was saved, that I'm still here. The days that followed were calm. I kept writing, now without urgency, just to record, to not forget. Ruth and I started the garden. It bloomed slowly, like everything true. We adopted the dog, an old, limping mutt with sad eyes and a tail that took days to wag. But he, like me, found shelter too. And then, on an ordinary morning, as the sun touched the edge of the window and the kettle whistled, in the kitchen, I found myself smiling alone. There was no specific reason. Nothing extraordinary was happening, but in that moment I realized the miracle wasn't the light that saved me from death. It was the life that every day since then has called me back with small gestures, whispered names, silences full of presence. Now when someone asks me how I survived, I answer calmly, it wasn't just luck, and it wasn't just strength, it was grace. Because the greatest victory I've ever known was learning to live after the war, and if there's a miracle, it's this: peace after fear, laughter after pain, love after absence.